Beyond the farthest edge of sun-scorched dunes, where the wind carried a faint, unearthly howl across the barren plains, the great Kelash River had once flowed mightily. Its rushing waters gave life to sprawling farmland and bustling markets that thrived on its banks. Travelers spoke of the river's endless bounty, a steady force that sustained entire dynasties through storms, droughts, and conflicts. Now it was all but gone, a winding stretch of cracked earth, riddled with fissures so deep they seemed to whisper from beneath. No one could remember precisely when the waters began receding, only that season by season the Kelash shrank, sometimes too subtly for alarm. But in the last few years, it had disappeared at an alarming rate. Explorers who attempted to trace its path reported dried basins, brittle shells of once lush riverine forests, and half-buried ruins where ancient civilizations had anchored their hopes. Rumors spread that the Kelash had not simply diminished by natural means, but had been called back by a force older than mortal memory. At first, such talk was dismissed as the superstition of farmers who clung to legends during desperate times. Yet strange occurrences soon fueled the ominous tales. Eerie nocturnal lights dancing along the dead riverbank, inexplicable tremors shaking villages, and low-frequency rumbles echoing from underground chambers newly exposed by the receding waters. Scholars arrived from distant cities, determined to investigate. They unearthed shards of pottery, fragments of inscriptions in unknown languages, and battered relics that seemed to predate every empire known to history. Whispers abounded that perhaps these relics belonged to a lost age, when watchers celestial beings cast into the mortal realm were chained beneath the earth to keep their rebellious might contained. Many scoffed at the idea, attributing the relics to some unnamed ancient kingdom. But then a traveling caravan stumbled upon something bizarre in one of the deepest cracks where the river had once run. Beneath twisted roots and collapsed stone slabs lay the top of a colossal door carved into the bedrock. The door's surface bore swirling symbols that no living soul could decipher. Intrigued, local expeditions formed to excavate it. But as they pried away layers of sediment, the earth shook violently, and muffled sounds akin to distant thunder rolled up from the depths. Researchers were left rattled by a sense that whatever lay behind the door was not meant to be disturbed. Nonetheless, curiosity prevailed. A team of archaeologists, mystics, and mercenaries banded together, braving the suffocating heat and risk of collapse. Over weeks of painstaking labor, they revealed a corridor of polished stone sloping down into a massive chamber carved eons ago. Shimmering lines of an unknown metal were inlaid in the walls, forming geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in torchlight. Skeptical scientists debated among themselves. Was this some advanced architecture from a prehistoric era, or proof of mythical watchers spoken of in obscure texts? Tension simmered as they pressed onward. They uncovered towering pillars shaped like robed figures whose features were eroded by time, arms raised as if holding something unseen. At the chamber's center, a dais rose from the dust, bearing a slab of black stone etched with symbols reminiscent of binding rites found in apocryphal scripture. By day, they toiled to document every marking. By night, they were plagued by strange reverberations that seemed to come from beneath the dais. A low hum, layered with faint, dissonant chanting. Some claimed they felt a presence, neither alive nor entirely dead, lingering in the stale air. Lab instruments malfunctioned unexpectedly, lights flickered, and a pervasive unease took hold of even the bravest. In the nearby village of Darnham, the drought worsened, leading to fading crops, parched livestock, and restless inhabitants. Local elders told cautionary tales of an ancient downfall, a time when beings from the heavens taught forbidden knowledge to mortals, corrupting entire kingdoms. The Supreme Maker, outraged, cast these watchers below the Kelash's depths, sealing them behind iron gates. If the waters ever withdrew enough to expose their prison, it was said that humanity would face a reckoning of cosmic proportions. Some villagers muttered that the ongoing dig was courting doom. They urged the scholars to abandon their quest, to let the watchers remain entombed. But news of the find had spread to distant lands, and rival powers thirsted for whatever marvels lay hidden there. Relics of unimaginable value, or possibly a weapon that could shift the balance of power. Tension escalated when mercenary factions converged on Darnam, each wanting a claim to the underground domain. Under the scorching sun, caravans loaded with digging tools and weapons arrived in procession, each escorted by grim-faced guards. The once quiet village became a haunt of rivalries. Heated arguments broke out in the dusty streets, often turning violent. Through it all, the excavation team kept working, feverishly determined to solve the enigma of the lost corridor before outside forces seized control. The labyrinth extended far deeper than any had anticipated. At intervals, they found half-collapsed altars ringed with engravings that depicted a chain-like motif, apparently hammered into the stone with an otherworldly alloy. In one cavern, they discovered shards of what appeared to be a sword blade larger than any standard weapon, its metal corroded to a dull green. This relic bore no resemblance to documented swords of known civilizations. Although many speculated it belonged to some ancient champion, others suspected it was forged for a more dire purpose, maybe used in battles that transcended mortal comprehension. One evening, as a crimson twilight blew across the horizon, a deafening rumble shook the entire site. Cracks split the floor near the dais, releasing a sudden gust of heated air that reeked of sulfur. The team scattered, hearts pounding, certain that the Watcher's prison had fractured. In that moment, a faint roar echoed from the chasm beneath the stone slab, distinct yet impossible to classify. Some described it as a bestial cry, others heard a chorus of discordant voices entwined. An indescribable dread seized them all, as if a veil between realms had thinned. Word spread quickly through the warring factions in the village. Something was stirring below, and chaos might soon be unleashed. Religious zealots interpreted these events as the dawn of a prophesied tribulation. Mercenaries saw an advantage in harnessing an unknown force. Fear galvanized each side, driving them to claim the site. Many demanded the archaeologists cease their meddling, while others insisted that unveiling the Watchers could grant unstoppable power. Meanwhile, the Kelash, once a majestic lifeline, was now almost a memory little more than trickles in dusty channels leading nowhere. Tensions climaxed when, late one night, heavily armed raiders stormed the camp. The lead archaeologist, an older woman named Sariel, was compelled to guide them to the subterranean days. She'd spent her life collecting half-forgotten prophecies about Watchers and heavenly rebellions. Though her belief in such tales had been scholarly rather than devout, she now felt every hair on her neck bristle with primal fear. Under the flickering glow of torches, the raiders forced Sariel to direct them through the corridor. The mercenaries planned to pry open the days, believing unimaginable treasure or power lay beneath. Their leader, an embittered warlord, scorned warnings about cosmic devastation. He brandished a battered relic said to be from some older empire, proclaiming he would harness whatever lurked below for his own ends. While many archaeologists pleaded for reason, Sariel alone recognized the final puzzle etched in the days' surface. An ancient script describing a seal that kept unspeakable entities locked away. If the days was moved without the proper ritual, the Watchers would be freed. Sweating in the oppressive heat, the raiders hammered crowbars under the dais edges. A thunderous crack resounded as centuries of dust shook free. The dais shifted, revealing a cavernous pit descending into utter blackness. A wave of scorching air billowed out, accompanied by a low, guttural vibration that pulsed through the stone. The Watchers, it seemed, could sense their confinement weakening. Sariel mustered courage. With trembling voice, she began reciting lines from the half-deciphered text, an incantation to reinforce the seal. But the warlord's men shoved her aside, convinced her chanting was a pointless superstition. Suddenly, the days lurched fully, tipping into the pit. A blinding surge of red-orange light tore up from below, swirling with shadowy forms that defied logic. The Watcher's presence was no longer a rumor, it roiled in the open air like a violent storm of howling energies. Screams erupted as the raiders were overwhelmed by waves of intangible force. Some dropped weapons and ran, others fell to their knees in hysterical terror. Torch flames twisted into unnatural shapes, casting monstrous silhouettes. As the Watchers spilled forth, the corridor itself seemed to warp. Sariel crawled across fractured tiles, heart hammering. The dazed warlord stumbled backward, tears streaking his dust-caked face, fury replaced by raw fear. Outside, in the once sleepy village, lightning shot across a cloudless sky, and livestock panicked. People gazed toward the dig site with dread, some dropping to prey, others scrambling to gather meager belongings and flee. The Watcher's unearthly presence began affecting the environment itself. A swirling wind kicked up an unholy dust that seemed charged with sparks. The few archaeologists and villagers near enough to witness felt their minds pounded by waves of despair and awe. Sariel, somehow shielded by an inner calm, recognized lines from the text describing a binding tempest that had to be invoked if the Watchers were ever stirred. Steadying herself, she chanted the incantation properly, voice reverberating against the chamber walls. For a moment, the Watcher's swirling shapes slackened, as if resisting an invisible barrier. But her voice alone was not strong enough. She needed the chord of multiple tongues. Summoning her last resolve, Sariel beckoned to a terrified colleague. Together they repeated the litany in unison, weaving ancient phrases of banishment. The Watchers recoiled, rage palpable in their silent roar. With a violent jolt, the swirling vortex hissed back toward the pit. The entire corridor groaned, dust cascading from the arches. Sariel pressed her bleeding hand against the day's severed edge, chanting faster until her throat burned. Slowly, agonizingly, the roiling darkness retreated, sucked once more into the earth's deep layers. The warlord, half delirious, lurched forward as if to destroy Sariel, but a final shockwave slammed him into the crumbled pillars, leaving him unconscious. At last, the Watcher's manifestation sank beneath the pit, sealed anew by the incantation's power. The air grew still, though it crackled faintly with leftover energy. Sariel collapsed, tears of relief mixing with dust on her face. A handful of survivors, archaeologists and raiders alike, stared at each other in mute disbelief. Over the next hours, they maneuvered the fallen days back into place with improvised rigging, finishing the sealing chant in full. By dawn, the corridor was silent again, though cracks remained, and the days no longer perfectly fit. The Watchers were contained, but the barrier was more fragile than before. When they emerged under a ghostly sunrise, they found the Kelash unexpectedly flush with a small current, as if the land itself had conjured a modest flow in response to the Watcher's near release. Though feeble compared to its former glory, the water shimmered like a fragile promise that the region might not be beyond redemption. The battered warlord and his surviving men slunk away, scowling, no longer lusting for hidden power. Most of the archaeologists vowed to keep the site's true nature secret, burying it under official disclaimers of unstable ground. Villagers trudged home wearily, aware they'd witnessed something no mortal words could fully convey. Sariel lingered a while, gazing at the faint trickle that now ran where the Kelash once rode. She recalled lines from the ancient text that prophesied, in times of dire dryness, the Watchers would stir. But so long as faith and vigilance stood firm, the cycle of captivity would hold. The half-broken days might endure for years or centuries. Perhaps new guardians, generations yet unborn, would return to maintain that seal. In a final act, Sariel scrawled fresh warnings at the chamber's entrance, instructing any who might descend in the future. Then she turned away, footsteps echoing along the ravaged ground. None could say what cosmic battles might someday reignite beneath the Kelash's bed. But for now, the Watchers slumbered once more, and the precarious hush of dawn stretched over the desert. With the faint glimmer of water beneath the rising sun, both dread and hope clung to the dust-filled air. Thus began a new chapter for the land of the Kelash, a momentary reprieve in which ancient chains still held, though thin cracks told the story of how close the mortal world had come to unleashing what lay beyond. And as caravans gradually resumed their trade routes, and the wind scattered footprints across the silent plains, none could forget that the Watchers, bound or not, would forever lurk in humanity's shadow, waiting for faith to falter. Yet in the days that followed, an uneasy hush clung to the desert. Sandstorms came and went, veiling the distant dunes and swirling through the half-buried ruins. But the Kelash carried on with its modest flow, as if reluctant to vanish completely again. Sariel spent her final week near the river, documenting stray fragments that had washed up pieces of carved stone broken off from the subterranean corridor when the days collapsed. She carefully noted each symbol etched into them, interlocking spirals reminiscent of chains, symbols of watchful eyes, and something that looked like a serpent's coiled tail. Though she possessed limited time and even less support, she believed these fragments might hold clues on how to reinforce the gate's seal if it ever weakened once more. Locals in Darnam eyed her with both fear and respect. She rarely left her makeshift tent pitched beside a dry canal, poring over her notes under lantern light. At night, villagers whispered of hearing strange murmurs on the wind, though no obvious quake or surge had followed. Occasionally, Sariel also sensed faint tremors, but they never built to the thunderous roars of that catastrophic evening. It was as if the Watchers, momentarily stirred, now lay in restless half-sleep. Meanwhile, some of the raiders who had survived the day's unveiling fell into eerie silence or drifted away from the region altogether. Rumors surfaced of them mumbling incoherently about faces in the dark and war in the depths. Merchants found them wandering the trade roads alone, wide-eyed and jumpy. A few, consumed by guilt or fear, made quiet pilgrimages to Darnam, seeking forgiveness for almost unleashing chaos. Sariel allowed them to speak without condemnation, yet even she had no comfort beyond describing the still pulsing wards that kept the Watchers locked down below. She understood that redemption from this trauma was a personal odyssey each survivor would have to undertake. On the 10th dawn, since the Watchers' near release, a shifting alliance of soldiers and scribes arrived from a distant city-state with formal orders to inspect the Kelash Basin. Their leader, an aging official with the crest of an eagle pinned to his cloak, held himself with practiced dignity. He politely requested Sariel's cooperation, explaining that rumors of impossible horrors had reached the ears of powerful patrons. Sariel, though uneasy, led the group to the corridor's entrance, ensuring they remained at the threshold and went no farther. The official's expression turned grave as he studied the carved archway, glimpsing the days far below in the dim torchlight. A press of stale heat against his face seemed to confirm that something lurked. Sariel explained how the Watchers had nearly broken free, how a chaotic swirl of force had burst forth, and how the seal was only partially restored. She urged caution, warning him that meddling deeper could undo everything. The official listened with steady focus, eyes hooded beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Finally he nodded, ordering his retinue back from the threshold. It was obvious that they too felt the air's menacing weight. That evening, under a sky blazing with stars, the official met Sariel in private. He revealed that certain authorities believed in the Watchers and desired to harness them as a deterrent against rival nations. Though his personal convictions were murky, he admitted that if the Watchers truly existed, the temptation to exploit them would be difficult to restrain. Sariel's heart clenched at the thought. She assured him that pursuing such an idea was lunacy, unleashing unstoppable devastation in exchange for fleeting power. The official sighed, explaining that he held little influence over those who might later arrive demanding access. "We live in a fracturing world," he said, desperate for an advantage. Nonetheless, he promised to deliver her warnings and recommended that she share her research with no one else, lest less scrupulous individuals weaponize that knowledge. Days later, the scribes departed, leaving behind a tense quiet. Sariel considered burying her notes or burning them altogether. But doing so might doom future guardians who stumbled onto the Watcher's lair without any guidance. At last, she chose to hide copies in 3 small caches along the Kelash's bank, each concealed behind false stone slabs. She reasoned that this would keep the knowledge safe from casual opportunists, while giving earnest defenders a chance if things ever escalated again. A pale sunrise cut through the haze when Sariel finally packed her belongings. Slinging her satchel over one shoulder, she walked along the water's edge for miles, pausing at intervals to sense any trace of tremor. The current gurgled weakly, gulls circled overhead, and children scampered through muddy shallows where farmland once thrived. The innocence in their laughter felt painfully fragile, a reminder that the Watcher's threat lurked beneath the surface. On the horizon, wind-whipped dunes swayed, drifting patterns across the once lush plain. The relentless dust devils conjured illusions. Sometimes Sariel fancied she glimpsed colossal silhouettes braced against the sky, like spectral watchers standing guard. She pressed onward, resolved that her role now lay beyond the Kelash. If new watchers roused or if factions returned to pry open the corridor, an unprepared world would need all the help it could get. It was time for her to find others who believed, who might band together to protect humanity from forces it scarcely comprehended. As she vanished into the shimmering desert, the morning light glinted off a faint stream winding its way along the Kelash's ravaged bed. In Darnam, folks rose to greet the day with cautious hope, their battered spirits longing for renewal. Yet, an unspoken awareness lingered beneath the daily bustle. The Watchers might be sealed, but their presence would forever cast a deep, uneasy shadow. And in the hush before the midday sun grew fierce, if one listened closely by the old canal or near the stone ring where the dace once moved, one could still hear echoes, soft, near imperceptible vibrations that hinted at something vast and timeless lying in wait, bound by fracturing chains, ready to test the resolve of mortals the moment faith faltered again. Beyond the desert's edge, Sariel trudged for days under a white-hot sun, finally reaching a caravan trail that led to the fortress city of Murray. There, pale adobe ramparts loomed under the glare, and traders from every corner of the continent bartered in a bustling bazaar. Exhausted from her trek, she booked a cramped room at a worn tavern near the city's eastern gate. By dusk, word had spread that she was a researcher from the distant Kelash region. Her dusty coat and cautious manner portrayed her as someone who had uncovered unsettling truths. Whispers of watchers and sealed corridors found willing ears among certain scholars. One evening, while Sariel quietly studied her notes in a candlelit nook, a lean man in faded robes approached. He introduced himself as Achon, an emissary of an obscure temple devoted to guarding the ancient boundaries. Rumor said the Watchers had awakened, he told her in a tense whisper, and that factions driven by greed were already scheming to exploit any demonic force rumored to dwell below the Kelash. Achon believed no single guardian could stand alone. Multiple enclaves across the land maintained clandestine archives on Watchers, hoping to keep these primordial threats locked away. Sariel tensed at his mention of Watchers, uncertain whether to trust him, but Achon produced a slip of parchment inscribed with symbols eerily similar to those on the days. He claimed his temple had tested protective wards centuries earlier. For a moment, relief fluttered within her. Perhaps here was someone who understood how dire the danger truly was. She cautiously recounted the near catastrophe at the corridor, how the seal was only partially renewed, and how malicious powers might return to pry it open. Achon's expression darkened. He confided that, according to his order's prophecies, once the Kelash water receded enough to expose that gate, the Watcher's captivity was on borrowed time. Unless multiple guardians convened to strengthen the wards, the seal would inevitably weaken once more. He urged Sariel to accompany him northward to a temple fortress perched in the Jorish Mountains, where protectors from various regions secretly converged. Sariel hesitated. She'd vowed to share her knowledge sparingly, but the memory of swirling cosmic fury below the Kelash haunted her, and she knew a scattered handful of caretakers might never fend off powerful nations or renegade cults drawn by the Watcher's rumored might. By dawn, she agreed to join him. They departed Mari discreetly, riding battered mules around the city walls to avoid watchful eyes. For a week they climbed foothills layered in pale scree, pushing their animals through serpentine passes. Scrub brush and thorny brambles replaced desert sands, and the nights brought chill gusts that rattled their meager campfires. Each evening, Serial pored over her hidden copies of the Dace inscriptions, while Achon recited half-forgotten prayers, meant to bolster protective wards. High in those stark highlands, they encountered a crumbling watchtower manned by robed ascetics, its beacon unlit for years. After hearing Sariel's story, these ascetics revealed that a traveling war band had asked them days earlier about sorcerous relics from the Kelash ruins. Spooked by the Watcher's rumored existence, the war band pressed on, presumably en route to claim or shatter the buried gate. Alarmed, Sariel and Achon hastened to the next valley, hoping to outpace any band of raiders that might threaten the Watcher's prison anew. As days blurred, frost-laced winds battered the rocky trails, and jagged peaks blocked out the horizon, but they finally glimpsed the temple fortress. A cluster of spires clinging to sheer cliffs, banners snapping in a restless gale. Within the fortress's dim antechambers, they found a council of solemn faces, keepers, mystics, scribes, and a handful of knights pledged to an ancient vow. Achon relayed their harrowing account of the Watchers, the cracked days, and Sariel's partial renewal of the seal. Grim acceptance washed over the council as they realized the ancient threat was no distant legend. At long wooden tables stacked with scrolls, the keepers pored over multiple volumes describing other wards across the land, each containing references to four-bound storms or fallen luminaries. Sariel recognized parallels to the Watchers she'd almost unleashed. In hushed tones, the council concluded that refortifying the Kelash site would require a coalition of guardians traveling there in secret, with warding scripts and relics. Yet the specter of heavily armed factions aiming to capture the Watchers added a volatile risk. If any pitched battle erupted near the dais, the slightest upheaval might fracture the seal irreparably. That night, as mountain winds howled past the fortress walls, Sariel sensed a foreboding shift and undercurrent, as though the Watcher's distant presence pulsed through the world's veins. She left her chamber to wander tortured corridors, finding Achon kneeling in a chapel's alcove, chanting quietly. Outside the stained glass window, streaks of lightning illuminated the black sky. It felt like an omen. Eventually a plan formed. At dawn, 4 small teams would set out, 2 to track and deter the rumored war band, 2 others to collect any arcane knowledge from lesser-known archives. Sariel would lead a final expedition back to the Kelash, carrying newly gathered wards in hopes of permanently sealing the Watchers. Time pressed them, none knew how long until the Watchers probed the cracks or a reckless party tried to breach the days. As she packed her gear, Sariel's heart pounded with a mix of dread and fierce determination. In the flickering light of the fortress candelabras, she glimpsed the reflection of her own eyes, hollowed by strain yet alive with purpose. Once an impartial scholar, she was now a reluctant sentinel, entrusted to hold back an ancient horror. Even if they succeeded in resealing the Watchers, the question loomed. How many more times could the mortal world outrun a threat older than civilization itself? And if the Watchers were truly but one site of cosmic imprisonment, how many more silent prisons might crack as greed, war, and ignorance wore down the centuries-old barriers? She did not know, but she understood this much. By the time the next desert winds scarred the plains, she and the keepers must stand at the collapsed corridor once again, prepared to confront whatever lurked below. In that silent vow, she steadied her resolve, ready to challenge the Watchers a final time before humanity's fragile hope was drowned in darkness forever. And so, under steel-grey dawn skies, Sariel departed the mountain fortress with a small contingent of resolute keepers. Their horses kicked up dust along narrow switchback trails, the icy wind cutting through cloaks and stinging faces. Seldom did anyone speak. Each was consumed by the knowledge that a force older than myth might soon break free. While a pair of scouting parties fanned out to deter the warband said to be roaming the highlands, Sariel's group pressed southeast with grim urgency. Over the next week, they battled flash storms and precarious ravines, forging on until the land began its slow descent into the desert basin. Yet even from afar, they sensed the Kelash region had changed. Once they reached Darnam, they found it half-abandoned, windows boarded up, shops shuttered. The ragged few who remained whispered of ominous tremors in the night, of a terrifying glow that sometimes pulsed along the horizon where the old corridor lay. None dared stay long outdoors after sundown. Local hunters told of shrieking echoes that made livestock bolt in terror. A tangle of rumor hinted that the warband might be close by, seeking to seize any dark power for themselves. Sariel and the keepers wasted no time. Led by Achon, they rode through eerie twilight to the excavation site. The approach felt dreamlike. The sandy river stood nearly dry once more, revealing dark fissures where floodwaters had recently receded. The corridor's entrance yawned at the foot of a toppled arch, and beyond that threshold, unnatural vibrations pulsed beneath their boots, as though the earth itself was breathing in dread anticipation. Shadows cast by torchlight twisted along the corridor's walls, giving the carved robed figures a menacing illusion of movement. Near the dais, cracks had widened into jagged gaps, and the metal lines inlaid on the floor flickered with sporadic sparks. The watchers were restless. The keepers swiftly arranged rune-inscribed stones around the dais, each etched with wards gleaned from hidden archives. Achon and two road companions lit censers of pungent incense, reciting the same incantation Sariel had used before, only now in a chorus that combined multiple dialects, all speaking to the ancient chain motif. Around them, a ring of keepers stood guard, swords drawn and eyes flicking between shadows. Suddenly, a dull tremor shuddered through the chamber. A swirl of hot air burst from the cracks, rattling their ward stones. The days groaned as if pressed from below, and that same cosmic roar Sariel had felt in her nightmares started to build. But this time, the Watcher's presence manifested more clearly, culminating in a swirling vortex of colorless wind that raked the chamber. Achon's voice rose above the din as he chanted, calling forth the binding wards. The swirl convulsed with unholy fury, lashing columns of dust and shards of broken stone. The dais bulged upward, nearly toppling Sariel. She clung to a support beam, panting, and resumed her own part of the incantation. Suddenly, the corridor behind them erupted with noise, clashing steel and hoarse battle cries. A knot of armored figures stormed in, eyes wild. At their head was a fierce man brandishing a warped sword, the rumored warband's leader. He bellowed, "Stop your sorcery. Whatever power dwells here is ours." Caught between watchers threatening to break loose and an armed onslaught, Sariel and the keepers flinched. But Achon pressed on, chanting even louder. The watcher's vortex flared, snapping out in arcs of crackling energy that hurled dust against the intruders. Some reeled in terror, others, fueled by greed and desperation, pushed closer. One of the keepers defended Achon, crossing blades with the warband leader. Sparks flew as they fought amid swirling grit. Meanwhile, two of the robed mystics huddled over a battered chest containing relics, small polished tablets said to be crucial for the final seal. If these tablets were set in place at each corner of the dais, their runes would fuse with the corridor's foundation, forcibly rebinding the watchers. But a warband soldier shattered one mystic's staff, kicking him aside. The relic chest nearly fell into a crack. Sariel lunged, snagging it at the last instant. She sprawled on the floor, the Watcher's gale howling above her, the iron-lunged roars of raiders echoing all around. Heart pounding, she pulled open the chest. The tablets glowed faintly, etched with labyrinthine script. She had only moments to position them. Scrambling over broken stone, she placed the first tablet at the daze's southwestern edge. At once, a swirl of golden lines rippled out, merging with the floor's ancient designs. 2 corners to go. Achan was near the daze center, eyes squeezed shut in concentration, chanting with unstoppable fervor. The Watcher's swirl responded with violent thrashes of air. Stones crumbled from the ceiling. The warband reeled, torn between snatching at the swirling power and retreating from the chaos. A second mystic snatched a tablet from Sariel's hands and slid across the floor to the daze's opposite corner. Another golden ripple erupted, forging a partial chain of runes around the daze. The Watchers let loose an ear-splitting wail, a sound that vibrated deep in the bones, something between a billion voices and an avalanche. The warband leader staggered, dropping his weapon. Eyes wide, he seemed caught in a surreal vision of cosmic terror. He clutched his head, then mustered a wild cry, stumbling forward. In a final bid to control the Watchers, he lunged toward the daze, only to be caught in a blast of scorching wind that flung him back, his scream lost in the cacophony. Sariel crawled toward the last corner, a broken pillar blocking her path. Above, a chunk of ceiling tore loose. Rocks pummeled the daze, nearly knocking Achan aside. The Watcher's vortex roared, half liberated, swirling with pale arcs of lightning. If she failed to place the final tablet, all would be lost. Her arms burned, muscles trembling, yet she forced herself onward. Dust choked her lungs. She glimpsed a fallen keeper reaching out in silent encouragement. Summoning every scrap of will, she thrust the last tablet into place at the corner. A flash of radiant light exploded from the daze. Instantly, shimmering lines of runic script raced across the floor and up the walls, forming a new lattice of binding that enclosed the vortex. The Watchers bellowed in unison, an echo of raw hatred and ancient despair. Achan's voice rose to a final crescendo, the incantation culminating in a wave of spiritual force. With a thunderous crack, the daze sank back into alignment, sealing the cracks beneath. The vortex collapsed, sucked downward as though by a colossal gravitational pull, leaving an afterimage of unearthly sparks. A silence more profound than anything Sariel had experienced settled upon the corridor, broken only by the labored breaths of survivors. Slumped against jagged stones, Sariel felt the Watcher's presence recede into a deep, enforced slumber, locked behind the newly forged wards. A faint glow pulsed through the daze, testament to the renewed seal. Achan stood unsteadily, wiping grime from his face. The warband survivors huddled at the corridor's edge, eyes filled with awe and fear. Some wept, others seemed broken. Above, the collapsed ceiling had opened a small, ragged gap to the outside desert. Through it, late afternoon sunlight cut a stark column into the gloom, highlighting motes of drifting dust that glowed like gold. In that silent shaft of light, Sariel caught the sight of the Kelash's water creeping back, faintly glimmering as it seeped along the channel. As if nature itself offered a quiet nod to their victory, uncertain though it was. In the hours that followed, keepers tended wounds and gave water to even the warband men. No one had the heart to fight further. The Watchers had shown what waited at the boundary of mortal folly, and none wanted a second demonstration. Achan oversaw final rites around the daze, chanting softly to fuse the relic tablets with the corridor's bedrock. He explained that it would take decades of vigilance to ensure the Watchers never stirred again, but that the immediate threat had passed. The hush extended until dusk. At last, Sariel emerged from the corridor, leaning on a makeshift staff, sweat and dust caked across her brow. Outside, the sky blazed with crimson and violet, painting the battered desert in surreal color. Survivors filed out in small groups, exhaustion etched on their faces, yet a spark of relief evident in their eyes. A few villagers braved the sight, timidly approaching to ask if the danger was truly over. Sariel didn't lie, no seal was permanent without faith and guardianship. But for now, yes, the watchers lay shackled once more, the corridor repaired, the wards renewed. Darnam could breathe again. Night fell softly, stars igniting overhead like celestial watchfires. At the fringes of the newly quiet riverbed, Sariel and the keepers gathered, battered yet triumphant in a solemn circle. Achon offered a final prayer, giving thanks for the narrow victory. Torch flames flickered, revealing the determined faces of those who had fought to keep cosmic horrors from devouring humanity's fragile realm. In the days that followed, Sariel and her companions helped Darnam begin its slow revival. Merchants cautiously returned, farmland reclaimed small patches of irrigated green, and children's laughter once again echoed off the adobe walls. A hush of reverence lingered. The watchers near release had left an indelible mark. Eventually the keepers prepared to depart, each with a new mission: to fortify other ancient sites, share their knowledge of sealing wards, and ensure no malevolent power would be so easily awakened again. As they said their farewells, Achon pressed a small rune-carved medallion into Sariel's hand. "In case any crack reappears," he murmured, voice quiet but resolute, "we stand ready." At dawn, Sariel stepped onto the desert road outside Darnam, watching the first sunbeams stretch across the horizon. The Kelash River trickled nearby, not the glorious torrent of old, but a living current nonetheless enough to nourish hope. She walked onward, staff in hand, a worn satchel at her side, heart eased by the knowledge that despite mortal failings and cosmic terrors, good souls could unite to protect the future. High above, the sky shimmered, and in the hush of morning, she felt a faint echo of that cosmic tension. The watchers slept in sealed darkness, kept by fresh wards and the strength of humanity's will. The desert breeze carried the faintest whisper of relief, of triumph, and of humble vigilance. In that whisper lay a promise that no matter how many times dark forces threatened, there would be those who dared to stand against them, forging fragile but resilient chains of unity and resolve. Thus ended the Watcher's chapter, for now in a hush of dust and starlight, with the Kelash's waters quietly flowing under a dawn that promised a tomorrow still worth defending.